Hey everyone, and welcome to the Building Geniuses podcast, where we talk to geniuses throughout the commercial real estate and building automation industries, asking them how they've gotten where they are, who's walked alongside them, and how they're helping others along the way. And I'm your host, Tim Vogel. In today's episode, we're speaking with Steve Fey, the legend, with lots of very interesting connections to the industry. He's currently of Concentric IoT, and many of you may know him from Monday Live and also his role as the previous president of Tridium. So Steve, welcome to the Building Geniuses podcast.
Tim, it's great to be here for sure. I love the title, although I don't necessarily claim to be a genius. So
that's good. With a title like the Building Geniuses podcast, many people do humble themselves, and I think that's a good sign. No one yet has stood up and said, this is the one podcast that I'm willing to do because it finally lives up to the name that I. But I think when we talk about being building geniuses, it's also kind of a double entendre, has a double meaning of, we may be experts or we may be experienced in our field, but we're also trying to then build other people up to be geniuses as well. So building geniuses. That's kind of the fun meaning behind it. Well, I'm so glad you're here. To kick us off, Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're spending a lot of your time on these days?
So Concentric IoT is a cybersecurity services company specifically for this industry. We broadly describe it as OT, or operational technology, because cyber isn't just limited to building automation. When it comes to building control systems, of course, you have access control and video surveillance and elevator systems and lighting systems, and it's amazing actually how the digital footprint has expanded substantially over the past decade.
Yes,
I'm familiar with buildings now that have in excess of 20 different types of smart building systems in them, which is really remarkable when I look back over the industry career that I've participated in. So I'll use that as a starting point. But let's go back in time. I got into this industry in the early 1980s. I had been working for Texas Instruments, actually, in industrial controls in the early days of PLCs, and got recruited by Andover Controls in their early days. And Andover successfully tapped my entrepreneurial instincts, which have been consistent throughout my career. And at that time, Andover was just a $2 million company. And when I left them 18 years later, they were over $100 million.
Yeah, wow.
And so they were very much a leader in the evolution of direct digital control. And today, of course, they're part of the Group Schneider. But a funny story is I talked to a number of systems integrators and customers out there who still have the Andover Continuum system, and back in the early 90s when we first came out with Infinity, we needed to name its successor, and I'm the guy responsible for the name Continuum. So I could take credit for that.
Yeah, that's great.
But sales and marketing and management have been the areas where I have predominated. Even though I came out of my education as an electrical engineer, I've been in one form of marketing or sales and management throughout this time. But from the Andover standpoint, we came in at the very time when direct digital control was being essentially invented. So, the concept of DDC was already well established in the industrial arena, but that was the beginnings in 80, 81, and so on, of using essentially PLCs for all intents and purposes or microprocessor-based controls to, control an air handler, a chiller, a central plant, right? Those were the early days.
Yeah.
And so by the time we reached the 1990s, we had our next generation of product. And by the mid-90s, we were looking at this thing called the Internet. And we were one of the first companies to support an internet connection into our platform. So, needless to say, the internet has dramatically changed the way in which we can access any of these control systems today, particularly from a remote perspective, and it just continues to expand in terms of flexibility and power, and it's just how things are done today. Right?
Yeah, it really is incredible, and I feel like it's changing so quickly as well. I mean, just the pervasiveness of reliable infrastructure, all kinds of new vendors that are coming into the space, trying to capitalize on this growing momentum of adopting cloud-based technology. It's interesting. Have you always had this entrepreneurial spirit about you?
Yeah, it was absolutely. So I remember in '98 when I made a decision to leave Andover. I met with an outsource placement firm that actually gave me a test on my entrepreneurial bent, if you will.
Yeah.
And I scored, I think, somewhere about a 98 or a 99 on a scale of 100.
Wow.
So that sort of reinforced what my intuition was telling me anyway. And, when I look at my career, I've been involved repeatedly, and particularly right now, in a lot of different startups. Andover was a startup. There was no, at a $2 million level, there's no guarantee it was going to succeed. It did.
Right.
That's nice to say. After I left Andover, I was with a company, a startup, some ex-Andover employees, that ultimately the venture got rolled into under Software House as a next generation access controls product, but that now is owned by Johnson Controls because it was first Tyco Fire and Security, and then Tyco got bought by JCI. But the next major career opportunity for me was with Tritium in 2004 when I came on to run their sales. And Tritium was at that point had a decent footprint, but they were still relatively small. And yet over the next 8 years, we grew substantially. And as many people I think know, at that time in the early 2000s, you had, particularly in the building automation industry, you had essentially a lot of proprietary systems. And building owners, by the nature of our industry, they find it difficult to standardize on any one over time. So they end up with a variety of different control systems from different manufacturers, and trying to manage that all from one place was the challenge that Tritium took on, and very successfully achieved the solution to that problem by being able to have an open platform in which either Tritium or its partners could write drivers to all the different systems that wanted to use this middleware to access the systems in a common manner, in a common data format with a web browser.
Yeah. And
so Tritium grew substantially and continues to grow to this day. So this concept of middleware has been successful.
What facilitated the move from Andover to Tritium?
Well, so when the startup I was involved with that became part of Tyco Fire and Security.
Oh, yes.
At that point is when I left that due to some management issues going on. That's when I reached out to John Petsy, who a lot of you know and who just recently retired. And we started talking, and one thing led to another, and I ended up running sales for Tritium.
Yeah.
So that was that's how that happened.
So you were running sales while John was president and CEO?
CEO. Yep.
How many years was it between coming on board and then transitioning to the president role yourself?
2 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So I started in 2004, ran sales for 2 years, and then John left the summer of 2006, and then I took over for him.
Was that like a planned succession?
John left. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. I don't know. There was maybe in John's head there was a plan.
Yeah.
At that point, Honeywell owned us.
Yeah.
And John was kind enough to recommend that they put me in that role. Honeywell, of course, did their own due diligence, and I went through that process and was successful in getting the nod. And then from that point, I was in the role for the next 6 years, and we achieved some very substantial growth, which was, it's always fun to be in a growing organization. I enjoyed that during my Andover days.
Yeah.
Again, I enjoyed it immensely working for Tritium. But it's after I left Tritium, I didn't want to leave the Richmond area. My family had moved to Virginia, and we were all settled here. And so then the question was, well, there's no more automation companies. The backyard of Richmond is not the center for that. So I ended up joining an IT managed services company right here in Richmond, Virginia, as their president. And I ran that for 5 years. And why that mattered to what our conversation today is, if I think everybody who's going to be listening to this call can appreciate, I'm sure, how much IT technology has, if you will, infiltrated our lives in the automation world. So yes, we started using servers, in the 90s for sure. But slowly we started to adopt IP backbones, and now more and more, all of the controllers that are coming out, even at the unitary level, are IP based. And so the minute you start having networks of that sort, you're talking about firewalls and routers and switches.
Yeah.
And not just the 485 MSTP trucks that we got used to all during the 80s and 90s, and you could just, didn't have to have highly trained network engineers to design, lay out, and do your configuration. So, but the thing that's probably more germane for perhaps today's conversation is, in the 5 years I ran this managed services company, what we did for our clients, we were their IT infrastructure. We had a private cloud. We hosted all their core applications on our cloud, and in using a product like Citrix for virtual desktops.
Yep.
And so that gave us the ability to manage the desktops, manage the back end, manage their networks, and guess what? There are all kinds of issues just keeping all that infrastructure running, and suddenly I became aware of cybersecurity threats. We were seeing round-the-clock attacks on our infrastructure. Every week, without exception, at least one client had clicked on some attachment, and all of a sudden their server had been compromised with ransomware. And so, coming from the OT world, I had no idea what ransomware was, right? And I had no idea just how pervasive the threat landscape is in the IT world. Well, to my point earlier about how the OT industry has evolved to using essentially the same technology. We use the same servers. We use the same networks. We use the same network components. We use the internet. So guess what? The threats are the same. They live in both worlds equally.
Yep.
And you need to understand that. So when I left that company in 18, I was looking for what's my next venture going to be. And I ended up joining and starting a company called Totem Buildings, which was designed to help. I said, it's time to get back into the OT industry.
Yeah.
I've seen what the world is like in IT. I now understand that this cyber thing is a big issue. And oh, by the way, gosh, when I was, when I was at Tritium, and if I think about all the automation companies that I knew, nobody was really thinking about cyber.
Yeah.
So it was clearly an opportunity to help the industry. And so the Totem was really designed as a company to sell software for doing assessments.
Yeah.
And although the company ultimately didn't succeed, what we learned an awful lot. And that's one of the things about entrepreneurship. You're not always going to hit a home run.
Yeah.
If the odds are actually, in most cases, you don't get past the so-called chasm, right? Crossing the chasm thing. So you got to understand. But what I took from that and what I'm using today at Concentric is everybody now knows they have a problem. They don't know maybe where the problem is. They don't maybe not understand how big the problem is. But spending money, one-time money on doing assessments, there's some value in that, certainly. And depending on your situation, it can be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
The question the customers were interested in, tell me what I need to do.
Yeah.
What do I need to do to protect the system? And the answer to that is services. It's not a mousetrap. The challenge with cyber, unlike control systems, you can put them in, you can program them, and in many cases not touch them for many, many years, if at all.
Mm-hmm.
Cyber is a constantly evolving threat landscape, and it's multidimensional. Every day there's new viruses. Every day there's new forms of malware. There's new ways that if you will, the bad guys are attempting to get in.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to treat it. You got to recognize it for what it is, and that's why services, if you will, a managed service, is really needed. You can build in only so many protections into your software, but you're going to ultimately find, as Microsoft does, as all the big boys do, that they're constantly coming out with security patches because people find them and then they exploit them. So just, the basics of keeping your software up to date and keeping it patched. This is not something that should be considered optional.
And something as simple as password hygiene, right? Like, don't use simple passwords. Don't reuse passwords. Make them complex, and find a secure way to keep them and use them. So this 5 years as managed services for IT, and then you go into totem buildings directly after that. Was there ever a time where you sat back and thought, man, if I would have known this, 10 years ago at Tritium, I would have done these things differently?
I think in part the answer is yes, in the sense that you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Right? So every day you get up and you live in the sandbox you're playing in. And if I hadn't gone and done the IT thing, I just wouldn't. That's how I became aware of what else I maybe should have been considering. Okay? So even as relatively small a company as we were about a 50-person company. We had a full-time CISO.
Yeah.
Tritium didn't have a CISO.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. And they were, substantially larger than this managed services company I was with. But that whole mindset, that whole awareness it wasn't coming up. It wasn't hitting any of us in the face as something we should consider. Yet, had we thought about it, because we knew what was happening with the industry, obviously we knew that things were going to IP. We knew that the service. It's not like you didn't know,
right.
But you get segmented off. You just live in your world, and you don't necessarily stand up, look around, see what else is out there that you should be considering.
Yeah.
So there's a lesson learned in that, right?
Well, and the other thing that's interesting is, many people in the industry are talking about cybersecurity, and we're still waiting for kind of the wave of revenue and interest from the market to come and say, yes, we need more cybersecurity. So even with hindsight, I think anyone can look back and say, okay, 10 years ago, what could we have been doing differently for cybersecurity? No one was asking for it. Even if we did something, could we have monetized it? Because, that's now the path that we're in now is, the driving revenue while also providing value. And, it's a tricky spot now, because then, and maybe this could be my next question to you. I have ideas, but I want to hear yours.
Yep.
How do you sell or how do you approach cybersecurity in talking to customers without taking a fear-based tactic?
The way we approach that is through, you have to talk about risk management. So every customer out there knows that cybersecurity threats are something that they need to address on the IT side. So what I just said a few minutes ago about the fact that the way OT has evolved from a technical standpoint, from an architecture standpoint, you don't have to go much further than say, IT uses servers, we use servers. IT uses IP networks, we use IP networks. The IT uses internet, we use internet. So what do you think the chances are that our world is seeing the same things, whether you know it or not?
Uh-huh.
So that gives you some very good context in which to start to have a conversation. Now, unlike IT, where everybody's concerned about their data being stolen, and whether it's proprietary information, if you're in Europe and you got the GDPR requirements, and some of that's true now in California, or it's commercial, your intellectual property that you're trying to protect. There's data is the prime driver for the considerations. In our world, that isn't the same. So we don't have a lot of PII type data.
Yeah.
Okay? You do to a certain extent, obviously, on the security, access control, and video surveillance, things like that. That's certainly personal information. But building automation, not really, very little.
Mm-hmm.
But the consequences to keeping the building operational are real. So in our world, we worry about whether somebody can damage a chiller, whether they can shut the building down. If you got a data center, you can create all kinds of havoc because all that equipment is very temperature sensitive. So it's the mechanical, electrical issues that we bring to an owner's attention as a very significant risk they need to consider. Now, yeah, that's a certain fear. And now the owners will then react and say, "Well, never happened to me. Why should I be concerned?" Right? And there's some truth in that, but I would say this is that there's a range of risk based on the kind of building you have. If you're talking about a little retail shop in a strip mall, it's not the same as a 200,000 square foot office building with multiple tenants, and it's certainly not the same as a college campus or a data center provider. So you need to understand that the risk varies widely depending on the customer. Mm-hmm. So who are the customers that by their very definition have a lot to risk? Generally, it's the much larger facilities with a much bigger OT footprint and multiple tenants, or in the case of university students who need to get to class, right? So you got to take that into account. So don't go out trying to pitch the same thing to everybody, because it's not going to fly.
That's right. Yeah.
Because people are smart enough. Come on, what am I really worried about? So the approach that we take at Concentric starts there. Be realistic about the risk based on the type of facility. But then, what's the next thing you should really talk about? In our mind, it's that remote access.
Sure.
If I'm going to open up that control system to the outside world, I better protect it. And there are some very good solutions on the market to do that today. And who doesn't, as a service provider, who doesn't want to be able to access that system remotely? Why do I have to drive to the site come on, right?
Yeah.
This day and age, that's expensive. It's time consuming. and in many cases it's not necessary because you want to be able to troubleshoot the system before you ever get out there, so at least you come prepared, right? But IT departments in many large institutions have gotten so spooked by the attacks over the internet that in a lot of cases they don't allow these OT systems to have internet access.
Sure.
Today there are excellent off-the-shelf solutions, ones that we recommend and provide as a service that address that problem head on. So, and what you're seeking to do is you're looking to skewer that system altogether so it cannot be discovered. It does not have a public-facing IP address.
Right.
You're encrypting
step
all
one.
the data that goes.
Yeah.
And then you encrypt that data going over the internet in case there's some way it could be intercepted in some other way that you're not even aware of. Okay.
Yeah.
So you do those two things. As an owner now, you can feel very comfortable that I can give this access to my third-party suppliers who are servicing my building, and to my employees who want to, work from home if they're in the facilities engineering department. That's
right.
where we start.
I think cybersecurity is, or cyber threats, largely invisible, right? But very tangible. I mean, you feel them, they're painful, but it's not like a fire. I could see it, I know the danger, and, I know what I need to do to fix it. So I think there's kind of the anonymity of the risk that makes it difficult for people to really conceptualize and understand, get their hands around. So there's a lot of education that has to take place, but that also comes down to people in our industry as well. It's like we have to educate ourselves on what those threats are, and then once you have the education, now you can go and better understand for those individual target segments or industry segments, if you will, how that then applies to them. But then even the kind of person you sell to as a vendor or a system integrator is different than your typical building engineer, facility manager. What's the go-to-market? Who's the target audience for these kinds of conversations you're having around OT cybersecurity? Where are you seeing some of the good fruit?
The question is, how should these services go to market, right? And that part is still shaking itself out.
Yeah,
to be honest.
Yep.
It's not clear. It can go. There are multiple options. It can go through systems integrators. It can go through A&E firms. It can go through IT managed service companies, and of course, it can go direct to the building owner. Is it clear how most of it's going to shake out? It's not. Okay. And I would say that from the systems integration perspective, they're well positioned to put the basics in place because it's in their interest. There's a lot of, if you think about the systems integrator who wants to have that remote access into the building, if they can just answer that one issue about, I'm going to give you, don't worry, I've got this covered. I've got the secure access into the building. Here it is. And what often happens, particularly on the larger clients, is the IT department comes in and vets it.
Like a paratrooper. They just parachute in. It's like, wait a second, let me take a look.
Yeah, they fly. They drop in, right? And the problem now is a lack of understanding, training, experience in the systems integration community, the SI community. They're not comfortable with it, and because they're not comfortable with it, when they get called in to have that meeting with the IT folks, it can get doesn't always go well.
It's intimidating, it's scary, and some of those IT guys very intentionally ask difficult questions to try to vet out who they're talking to. right?
Yeah, they want to know, do you know what you're talking about?
Yeah.
So I'll jump ahead a little bit here in terms of, how I'm in part trying to give back to this industry. So how do we get a much more educated workforce in terms of cyber? And
Yeah.
so I got introduced, I don't know, 6 months ago to Melissa Boutwell at Automation Strategy and Performance, ASP. And she has developed a 1-year program, essentially for cybersecurity. The company does a lot of training for systems integrators in the OT industry. So if you want to learn, how to be essentially a project engineer, a systems engineer, software application engineer, it's got a whole course curriculum for all of those things. But she
Great.
recognized the need and actually worked closely with the Department of Labor to get funding to start to put this course together. And she reached out, and I became, along with half a dozen other individuals, her brain trust for designing the course. And the course is coming out now in January of 2023.
Yeah,
And
great.
it's a 1-year program, and you need to already be a trained systems engineer in the automation world to qualify to take this class, because it assumes you already know how control systems work. Okay, but what you get over is you're going to come out a year later with a certified stamp that you understand the big picture and the details around how to put how to put control systems in a secure fashion and keep them secure. And I think this is going to make this is a great opportunity for our industry to, at a very affordable price, and because of the work she's done with the government, there are a lot of tax incentives as well that you can get both at the federal level and at the state level to offset the course of the training.
Are you able to share, or do you know what exactly that cost would be for someone to take that
Yes,
course?
$4,000 per student.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that was
Yep.
a year-long course for $4,000. That's pretty good.
Yeah, you get 12 credit hours. Yep.
And then is that like an ongoing certification, or is it just a one-time program, grow through
It's a one-time. Yeah,
Okay,
right now it's
yeah.
a one-time. Yep.
So no continuing education or anything on the back end of it to maintain it?
Yeah, I think that's a good point about down the road. But right now, this is the first step in this direction, and it is, as I said, it's geared specifically at our industry.
Yeah.
And it takes the individual through not just the high level of things, the kinds of threats that are out there, and what to look for, and what policies and procedures should look like, but it also gets into the details of networking. And how you need to construct your networks to be secure, and then it gets into the details around the actual assessments that you would do to detect whether you've got vulnerabilities or not. So it's really comprehensive, and then it wraps up with what do I need to do on a regular basis to protect the system so that they don't degrade or lose their protection that you put in on day one.
And that's the maintenance and service side of cybersecurity, as opposed to
Exactly.
the black box.
Right.
Are there any? So again, this may be a question that, depending on how exactly you go to market with your current employer, but it's or current project, but are there any frameworks out there around cybersecurity that you would say are pretty well vetted for our space, something that we should go look into and be a part of?
Good question. So
Yep.
when I got into the totem thing, we started looking in particular at the NIST cybersecurity framework, which had been developed for the IT industry. And there are multiple IT standards out there that are well recognized and established. There's ISO 27001. There's multiple ISO, but there's ISO, and then there's the SANS Institute, and then there's NIST. And in the industrial world, ISA has got what's called 62443. Now, specific to our industry, the building automation in particular, there's several things going on there in the recent couple of years. Okay, one is that ASHRAE 13 is updating their building automation specification, and within it, there's a whole section on cybersecurity. So that's the first time that I'm aware of that they're doing this, and that's coming out for public sharing here of this year. Okay, so that's ASHRAE 13. Then there's an entirely new group called buildingcybersecurity.org that started by a guy by the name of Lucian Niemeyer, who has organized a lot of companies, big name companies as well as others, to put together just what you just described, a framework specific for our industry.
And for listeners and viewers, we actually interviewed Lucian on this podcast for the season finale of season 1. So you can go back to season 1, episode 12, and that was an episode with Lucian. Really, really amazing conversation.
Good. So I don't need to say any more. Just go watch that.
That's
that
right.
podcast.
That's right.
Yeah. But to Lucian's credit, he's addressing your question head on. Is there somebody in our industry who's looking specifically at cybersecurity for our industry? So, and they studied ISA 62443, and they studied a lot of other IT standards. And be honest, having done the same, all that stuff can get really overwhelming, really fast.
Yep.
And to the point where people throw their hands up and don't make any progress.
Right.
So I really think simple, think big risks, and think affordable. Those are really the key principles, and that's why I highlighted the what you need to do for remote access.
Yeah.
Because that's your number one. If you can prevent malware and DDoS attacks and any other kind of hacking from getting into your building, that's a huge risk that you've taken off the table, right? So that's where we start with all of our clients. Let's start there. Doesn't guarantee things won't happen, because you've got users in the building who, particularly if it's a converged network, are off doing all sorts of other things, and their computers can get infected with malware. And that can then end up moving on to your automation system, right?
Yeah.
So the second thing we always recommend is, what kind of a backup do you have on your server?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the answer to that question is, in many cases, not one you would be too impressed with.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's very common that the backup is on the server that is the automation server, which in the case of ransomware is useless.
Yeah. It's on a different disk. Yeah. Yeah. But same rack.
So our second point of big risk to address is protect your server, manage it properly like you would any IT server, and get a daily backup off of there in a secure location.
Sure.
And now you've got that 1-2 punch where if something does find its way in, and I now have got a problem, and I can't access my control system because my server's all locked up. Great, blow it away, put in the backup, and get back up and running.
Steve, let me ask you this question. Just kind of looking back through my notes here. Andover controls a significant amount of time at Tritium. You've spent several kind of chunks of sustained time at these companies. Has there been people at each of these that have really particularly impacted you or kind of helped encourage you along the way? I mean, let's go to Andover. 18 years, growth from 2 million to 100 million during your tenure, there had to have been some strong leaders that was a part of that, or really, again, anyone. Is there anyone that kind of stands out in your memory that was particularly helpful or encouraging to you?
In my Andover days, one of the things that I wanted, I was always looking to broaden my experience base. So I started as a sales engineer and went to become a product specialist, and it was always, what's the next thing that I can do? So I think if you're looking to rise with an organization, you need to have that desire, right? It doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
And you need to let people know. And you need to see when opportunities, my last job at Andover was running their systems business. And I put my hat in the ringer 3 times before I got it on the 3rd try. But one of the individuals who was very influential in my life was the head of sales and marketing, the VP at the time when I was basically a product manager. And he had actually been born and raised in Europe and wanted to bring Andover into Europe. And he threw out the opportunity to move over there and head up sales for Andover in Europe. I took that opportunity. That was
Wow.
That was a very meaningful period of my life, which paid huge dividends down the road for me, because I learned to speak a little bit of German. I traveled all over Europe. I met my wife over there. So you just don't know what's going to happen in your life, but the opportunity to become more of a person and grow your career by taking these risks and taking advantage of the opportunity, because it was easy enough to say no, right? But
Yep.
to pick up everything and go over there and start over again and not know when you're coming back, it's a good risk to take.
That's life-changing, right?
Yeah, it's life-changing, exactly.
And that's quite the entrepreneurial spirit also, to go and take a risk like that, to make a complete culture change, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I loved it. And then when I ultimately moved back to the U.S., I had the opposite end of the world because at that point we were looking towards Asia. So I got heavily involved in many trips into China and South Korea and the Philippines and so on. And that's when I at my Asia several years I did a lot of traveling to Asia. But
Well,
I think having done the European thing, it was just, okay, more countries, more experience. Let's keep going.
natural extension.
Natural extension, right?
That's really fascinating. I've had a very limited experience traveling around the world. Spent a little bit of time in Finland, Canada, Mexico. Did a mission trip when I was in high school over to Hungary and Romania. And those are very formative moments. You see different cultures. You have to learn to adapt, to understand. Sometimes it takes work to understand because it's so foreign to what you expect.
Right.
I just finished a book, an audio book today, where the whole last chapter talked about how to take cultural principles of a company and then go and apply those in another country and all the challenges that come along with that. Things like candor and how you explain something to someone. In some countries, you have to use very soft language or you're going to come across as like a major jerk. You use that same language over in, we'll say, Germany or the Netherlands. It's like, man, just tell me what you're saying. It's like, why are you dancing around the topic? And it can be so different, and how you handle that then helps you come back, let's say, to an American marketplace, better understand individuals and people, what makes someone tick versus someone else, and how you can then better communicate to them, motivate them, inspire them, and ultimately lead them. Which brings me to my next question for you. You've spent some time, at the top of organizations. And
Right.
a lot of times they say it's lonely at the top, but it really depends on the culture and the group and the management team that's around you.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that brought you that you feel brought you the most success being at the top and leading these organizations of various and growing sizes?
I'd say the number one thing for once you get to that level in an organization is the team you build around yourself, right? And how effective and how well you can work with that team, because you can't do it. Obviously, you can't do all this stuff yourself, right? You
Right.
need very good people that you can delegate the work to, and so that's critical. You've got to whether and in the top of a company, it's not one dimensional. So I came up in sales and marketing, but now all of a sudden finance is a big deal, and the R&D is a big deal. And so, do you have the right people in all those different slots, and do you know how to adjust your message and your communications and your priorities to each of these different department areas, right? So, you know, I think it's to wear all in part to essentially wear all those hats, or to think, to be able to understand what R&D thinks about
Hmm.
and the challenges they face and what they need to do to be successful, versus sales and marketing, versus finance, right? Versus manufacturing. Everybody's got a different set of needs, and then the team all has to play nicely together, right?
That's right.
So it does get a lot more political, both from the top down. But in the case of someone like a Tritium, who is owned by a Honeywell, there's a lot of politics going up,
Yep.
and that can be a significant part of the challenge for sure. But
Yeah.
that's not unusual, right?
Yeah.
Nothing really new there. But yeah, so I'd always wanted to rise up organizationally, which is why I intentionally try to broaden my skills over time
Yep.
and my experiences, but because that ultimately helped prepare me. I think having been an engineer out of school, I've never felt uncomfortable around engineers and software people. But I'm not a coder, but I always tried to understand what it takes for coders to be successful. And I've been blessed along the way, particularly at Andover, particularly at Tritium, with individuals who were highly skilled in software development, because that has made a huge difference for sure in the success. When you have a product, you've got to have something that really stands out, and so having really highly skilled software engineers is critical.
You bring up another point too about you have like engineering mindset and then maybe like that entrepreneurial growth business mindset. Did you ever find
Mhm.
those in conflict, or was it a pretty natural extension to switch between the two?
Culturally, if you're in an organization that's growth oriented, everybody wants to be successful, right? The engineers want to see it grow. The salespeople want to see it grow. So it's really about not stepping on yourself in the process, not overcommitting, but yet at the same time not taking your foot off the gas pedal.
Yeah.
So you don't want your sales team promising it's coming out next week when they damn well know it's not going to, right? But at the same time, you want to work with the engineers and make sure that you understand what they're up against,
Vision.
and if they're being blocked for some reason, get in there and help them, clear the way so that they can get the product out and get things fixed.
And then again, you were fortunate enough to have that experience of both, to be able to speak the language of the engineer and also the language of the sales business, finance side
Correct.
as well. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So what are some of the things coming up in the next few years that you see yourself like really diving into? I mean, I think a lot of this cybersecurity framework, that's going to start to flesh itself out. How do we get that into the marketplace as much as possible, not only as revenue opportunities, but to go out and secure the different aspects of all these different customers that are trusting their solutions to us. But is there anything, let's say 5 years out, that you really see as being a focus for you?
Well, you could argue in some respects I'm at the tail end of my career, right?
Yeah.
I could retire if I wanted to right now. I don't. I'm having too much fun. And,
having too much fun. I love it.
And I'm enjoying in addition to what I'm doing in cyber, I'm also involved with a company in the data analytics area, and I'm involved with a company in building automation. So, and in all respects, every one of them is essentially an entrepreneurial kind of environment that I'm working in. So that's what makes it fun for me, because I can draw upon my many experiences to help these emerging companies emerge, right?
Yeah,
because I've been there, done it, and I get excited by something new that's going to solve a problem, or just make our industry move forward. You mentioned earlier Monday Live. I've got a couple different areas now that I'm doing my sort of give back to the industry and on my own nickel, and one of them is Monday Live, and that is for those of your viewers who don't know what that is. It's a group of especially industry veterans who've been doing this for decades, and we started back in the COVID days to figure out what the heck are we supposed to do with all the people leaving the building. And it was just to help each other. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? Right. And after 2020 played itself out and it looked like we were going to have vaccines, we then said, well, what do we do next? Do we shut it down? And then we decided, no, not only do we like sort of keeping each other abreast of what's going on, we've all been in this industry to make buildings smarter. And that's what we're all about. So let's make that our focus. So every Monday at 3:00, we have an hour session open to the public. We encourage everybody to attend and hear. And we're very topic oriented. So that's one thing I'm involved with. And another is I got involved with the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, which is doing more behind the scenes work to develop and identify the kinds of things that the industry needs to do to get a larger percentage of buildings to go smart, and to understand what and to be very concrete in our efforts to achieve that. So we've got the ASHRAE show coming up in February. We've got a summit that Sunday afternoon, starting at 3:00. It's a Smarter Summit, and we're going to be together for 3 hours. We invite everybody who's going to ASHRAE, come on in and join us, because we're looking for more participants to join us in this effort.
Yeah.
So we've been working on a whole vision for how to make buildings smart. We've now been, for the past 6 months, been working up a framework document that describes all the various aspects that we believe are going to be needed to make our systems a lot more interoperable. Okay.
Yeah.
Because the key to taking advantage of all this wonderful technology is getting past the silos. So how do I easily get from my access to my lighting to my HVAC and so on? How do I pull it all together easily and inexpensively, and when I need it and how I need it? And so that's what we've been working on at the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, and we want to give everybody an idea where we see the industry going and how and encourage as much additional participation as possible.
Well, the last few months I've been following Monday Live much closer. I love that it's an open conversation, but then it's an open conversation to a smaller group, but then the chat is open for everyone watching. And so there gets to be this interactive dynamic as well, which I think is just really good and really healthy and helpful. So thank you guys for all the work and your contribution to that. And then also for the coalition, I think that's something that we plan on digging more into as well.
Good.
Steve, obviously, you have been a huge influence on the industry. You, I think, have made your mark. You continue to make your mark. But appreciate what you've done. You know, there's a legacy there that you've left. And I think, honestly, you know, that embodies this idea of building geniuses. And I'm so glad that you were able to come join me for this conversation. And I look forward to hearing from the listeners about what they think of it. I think they're going to be really, really pleased with it. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tim. I think it's great that you're doing this. So we appreciate it.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that wraps this episode of the Building Geniuses podcast, a production of KMC Controls. If you've enjoyed this conversation, we encourage you to subscribe and share. And if there's anyone that you would like to hear on this podcast, tag them in the comments or reach out to us and we'll tag them in the comments as well. As always, we appreciate you listening. And until next time, learn something new, teach someone something, and build your inner genius.